Hello, everyone. The number of attendees is still ticking up, but it is slowing down. So with that, I will get started. My name is Frances Madden. I am the Research Associate on the PIDS IRO Infrastructure Project, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for this workshop. We're delighted to see so many people here. A few housekeeping announcements, all very standard things. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared afterwards on the Towards National Collection YouTube channel, and we'll circulate it to all attendees as well. You've all joined muted, so we would ask you to please use the Q&A box for any issues that you might have. Either technical or any questions that you have around the presentations. We will also be using the Mentimeter tool, which some of you may be familiar with later on. So we'd ask that if you have a browser tab available for that, or another device that you can use, so we can gather your input. Great, so let me just progress onward. So in terms of the agenda for today, I'm just doing a short welcome and background to the project before giving an overview of the case studies. Then I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Roderick Page, who will give an update on the PID demonstrator. We'll have a short time for Q&A and hopefully a short comfort break after that. Then I'm going to talk through the new resource which we have created, Developing Identifiers for Heritage Collections, so that will all bring us up to just about an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussions after that. So a bit of background to the project. Those of you who have attended a presentation from this project before will probably be very familiar with this at this point. But for those of you who are new, this project is a 21-month project, which is a foundation project of the Towards the National Collection programme, and it's looking at persistent identifiers across collections in the UK. So we've got a diverse range of collections represented within the project team. It's led by Rachel Kotarski from the British Library, which is where I'm based as well. And then we have various co-Is and project partners, and you can see all the names of the institutions and the team members there too. So in terms of the aims and deliverables for this project, you can read them there yourself. Because it is quite a short project, we are hoping primarily through recommendations, guidance, case studies, that it will serve as a catalyst for wider change. And the idea is to increase the use of persistent identifiers in support of creating a national collection. So we're just over 1 year into the project at this point, and we held our project launch webinar in April last year, just at the beginning of lockdown. And in terms of what we've done since then, we've held 3 workshops. This is the 4th. We had a benchmarking survey and published the analysis from that in our early findings. We've produced 3 case studies, the last of which from the Natural History Museum just went live today, so it's hot off the press. We've created the PID demonstrator. We've also written up various sort of mini case studies and blog posts about sort of various aspects of persistent identifiers within heritage collections. And we also published early findings and recommendations from the project late last year, as well as creating an interim report, which is available from the Towards National Collection website. But links to all of these outputs are available on the resources page on the project website, if you'd like to consult them further. So that was just a quick bit of background on the project. Moving on now to the case studies. So we've created 3 case studies throughout the project so far. The aim of them is to help others see what the path to using persistent identifiers looks like and sort of how we as organisations got there. There are 3 are now available, as I've already said. And one thing that we've done within this is we've adopted a consistent definition of persistent identifiers throughout. So we've wanted a long-lasting reference to a resource, and by long-lasting we mean that it will last for a significant number of years. And we also want it to be an actionable link. By actionable, we mean that it can be clicked and it will take you to information about the resource or the resource itself. So that is a bit of background to the case studies. So the first one we produced was based on the British Library, so where myself and Rachel are based. And the British Library has a proliferation of identifiers in use, but the core identifier used within the main digital library system is the ARC identifier, so archival resource key. Archival resource keys are free to use, but you need to have a resolver. So you can either use a sort of general resolver that called N2T, or you can create your own. So at the British Library, we use our own resolver. These are created at the BL through a thing called the PII, so Persistent Identifier Infrastructure. And this interfaces with the other strategic systems that we have, such as ALIF, the library catalogue, and the DLS itself, digital library system. The identifiers themselves are not necessarily globally resolvable. So if you can see here with this link, so the ARC kind of continues from here, but you need to have this initial BL domain and item/viewer to be able to resolve to the item that you'd like to view. They are used for both internal and external purposes at the British Library, in the sense that they are used for the internal management and locating of items, but also for sort of accessing and citation by external users as well. It's also worth saying, though, that many items at the BL do not have persistent identifiers. So what I've just described there with the ARC system, that's used for digital collection items. But things that do not have a digital representation don't actually have a persistent identifier, either for the metadata or the item themselves. For example, books, they do have identifiers, but they're not persistent as based on the definition I provided earlier. So they, we use ISBNs and shelf marks to manage them, but because they don't have that sort of long-lasting actionable link, we wouldn't call them persistent identifiers. So just to bear that in mind. The other persistent identifiers that we use are digital object identifiers. So they're used within the shared research repository, and they're also captured within the ALIF catalogue too. So we can create DOIs within the research repository through our involvement with DataCite, and the British Library is actually the lead of the UK consortium for creating DataCite DOIs. We also use ORCID, which is the Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. So that's used by sort of active researchers primarily as a mechanism to identify them. And so that's moving more into identifiers for metadata elements as opposed to for content. Another identifier for metadata would be ISNI, which is the International Standard Name Identifier, and the BL is the registration agency for ISNI, so we create ISNIs. And those are being integrated within a sort of shared authority file called the LC-NACO file, which is used by many libraries around the world, and also in the British National Bibliography, which is a record of books published within the UK and Ireland. We started using persistent identifiers at the British Library for many years ago. So we implemented ARCs in 2012, for example. So that's nearly a decade ago. And obviously things change over time. Systems need to be upgraded and developed. So one thing we've recognised in light of this piece of work, and previously too, but we're working on developing a persistent identifier policy to explicitly describe the management of PIDs and to make sure that our approach is coherent sort of across the organisation, but also over time as well. So moving on then to the National Gallery. They've created linked open data URIs to identify their collection, and this is now being transitioned into a production system. And the URIs are created within a component of a wider middleware system. And the main motivation behind creating these identifiers is to connect information across different systems. So the idea that you just update information in one place and then it will get updated everywhere. These URIs can be used in several systems. So their collection management system is called TMS. They also hope to push it out to various APIs and for use in IIIF services as well. And they also include identifiers, other types of identifiers. So for example, DOIs, BIAF, within the collection management system. And this whole piece of work is part of sort of a wider piece around improving the availability of information about the collection at the National Gallery online. So this case study was produced sort of autumn last year, but since then, there's been an update, which isn't in the case study, but I thought we'd give you a bit of an update on what's happened since then. So ARC identifiers are now being created using URIs, and these are globally resolvable via the Entity Resolver. So what that means is, this is an example of one of the URIs using the data.ng-london namespace. But this second link would resolve to the same information using the entity resolver. So that's what we mean by globally resolvable. So there is no information here that states that it's related to the National Gallery. So it's completely opaque, which has various benefits associated with it. Equally, you could use this data.ng up to the .uk and then append this arc from the arc string onward, and that would also resolve. So various ways that these are can be connected. So then, most recently, we put together the case study on the Natural History Museum. So there is a mix of internal and external identifiers. At the moment, they use registration numbers and barcodes for managing their collection internally, but they're developing sort of a strategy around identifiers as part of a new data model for their collection management system, which they're in the process of upgrading. And they are going to be developing something that will be able to manage complex objects. What I mean by complex objects is where you have sort of one item and then you've got items related to it. So for example, you can have a physical item that would have a digital representation, and you want to be able to sort of manage those relationships between those two entities. Another example is where you have a rock, for example, and then you take a sample from that rock and conduct a chemical analysis on it. And you want to be able to manage the relationships between all those various items, so they can be quite sort of hierarchical and complex in the way that they need to be managed. The Natural History Museum has a data portal which it uses to provide access to external users to its collections, which have the elements of its collection which have been digitized. So at the moment, they've digitized about 4.8 million of the 80 million specimens that they have. And these are made available using global unique identifiers, or GUIDs. This is sort of created from in line with the CTAF Stable Identifiers Initiative. So there has been quite a lot of work in the natural history sector globally and on a European level around creating stable IDs for specimens. However, you can't really describe them as truly persistent identifiers because there isn't really any external governance to ensure their or defined governance and to ensure their long-term persistence. And that would be true of the ARC identifiers at the British Library as well, and that's why we want to create a policy to make sure that that's managed. The Natural History Museum also create DOIs for their data sets, which are created by sort of researchers that are affiliated with the museum. And those can be based on the specimens, but they don't necessarily have to be, but they make the data sets available via the data portal as well. And they're working on including ORCID identifiers within the data portal too for the contributors of data sets. Just a few comments about the findings from the Natural History Museum case study. Their collection has been managed sort of quite on a department by department level historically, and they're bringing that all together now. But that's meant that their approaches had to be quite incremental. Also, due to the scale of the collections that they're dealing with. So, by way of comparison, the Natural History Museum has 80 million specimens, whereas the National Gallery has 2,300 paintings. And it's much different scale. And this means that they kind of have to continue to work with what they've got and adapt their approach as they go along, but they can't really go back to the start and sort of apply start from the beginning again because it's just too much material. Another thing to say is that with the Natural History Museum, they sort of have potentially drivers in place around persistent identifiers that other cultural heritage organisations might not. So where scientific publishing has sort of had various drives towards open publishing practices and open data, that can be seen in within natural history collections in a way that may not be present in other types of heritage organisations. And the other thing to say is that this case study also covers a new type of persistent identifier that's in development through an emerging research infrastructure called DISCO. So they're creating a thing called a natural science identifier. So the case study contains some information about that as well. Great, so that is virtually it. I just want to make a few points about sort of conclusions from across the 3 case studies. I think it's worth noting that 2 of the 3 that we've covered so far, they use a middleware solution to create their identifiers. And that's in recognition of the fact that there are so many, these strategic systems that are so important can often be quite time consuming to make changes to. So they've opted for a sort of something that can interface with those systems rather than trying to hard code something into a system that would take a long time to change. It's also worth noting that all 3 of the organizations have to support various different types of identifiers for different aspects of their collection and for different entities within it. Guaranteeing persistence remains a challenge. So as I mentioned, both Natural History Museum, British Library, all of us as organisations sort of don't necessarily have sort of written commitments in place or strong governance to ensure the persistence. That isn't to say that things will become inaccessible, but it's just not necessarily very explicit at this point. Another thing that might be useful for anyone who's considering putting together business cases in support of implementing persistent identifiers is that they're often used to address internal use cases as much as external ones. So things like improving the reduction of errors, for example, with the National Gallery, this idea of updating information in one place and it being fed through to various locations, it reduces staff time. Also things like tracking location of items can be helpful for it as well. So various internal things as well as sort of external discoverability, citation tracking, understanding where your collection is being used. They're all those kind of external cases. Okay, so that is all from me. So I am going to make stop sharing and I will make Rod a presenter and hand over to him.